He has already been right twice, and now he is making a prediction that makes military analysts twitch. Professor Jiang does not guess, he calculates. Through game theory, through the logic of conflicts, through the weak points of systems. And his conclusion sounds harsh. The US is being drawn into a war with Iran that it will not be able to win. But the most dangerous part is not even that. According to his calculations, what is at stake is not just a military outcome, but the collapse of an entire economic model the world has grown used to. Why are cheap drones beginning to outplay a superpower? Who is really running this game? And at what point does everything spiral out of control? Now let's break down his logic together, step by step. Agree. Forecasts can be treated in any way you like, until a person starts hitting the target too accurately. Professor Jiang is not a typical talking head. He works through game theory. He analyzes the behavior of states as a strategic game, where every move has a cost, a risk, and hidden consequences. His channel, Predictive History, is precisely about this. Not what happened, but why it was inevitable. And so, in 2024, he makes three harsh statements. Trump returns to power, the US moves toward conflict with Iran, and loses it. The first two are no longer a hypothesis. And now the third sounds not like a provocation, but like a cold calculation. The most interesting thing is that he does not rely on emotions or political sympathies. Jiang looks at the structure, resources, logistics, the psychology of the sides, the economics of war. And he asks an uncomfortable question. Are you even sure that the United States of America is now playing the game it is used to winning? Because, according to his logic, the rules have already changed, while the strategy has turned out to be old. And this is where the most intense part begins. If he is right, then this is not about a difficult war, but about a scenario where the result is almost predetermined in advance. Then the main question is not who will win, but why was this even allowed to happen? What is interesting, friends, is that Jiang suggests looking at what is happening without the usual frameworks, and that changes perception. He literally says, Iran is not trying to defeat the US in a direct confrontation. No, because that is immediately a losing strategy. Instead, it changes the very object of attack, not the army, not the territory, but the system that makes the US a superpower. And this is where the most dangerous part begins. His key idea is, modern power is not missiles, but linkages. Oil equals money, equals investment, equals technology, equals military power. Iran, according to his analysis, strikes precisely at these linkages. It does not destroy everything at once. It methodically destabilizes the supports. A strike on infrastructure is not local damage. It is a chain reaction. No energy, production stops, no stability, investment leaves, no investment, technological processes deflate. And in the end, the army, no matter how strong it may be, finds itself inside a system that is beginning to crack. And you know, the harshest part is the choice of targets. Jiang points out, the strikes are directed at places where the Persian Gulf countries, US allies, have no backup option: water, processing, transport. These are not random targets. These are points where recovery is either slow or critically expensive. And it is precisely through its allies that the US receives the main blow. That is, in essence, Iran is forcing America to defend not itself, but a vulnerable periphery, stretching its resources. And probably this is where his main thesis becomes especially alarming. This is not a war for victory, this is a war for the collapse of balance. Iran does not need to destroy the US at all. It is enough to make its system unstable. Because in the 21st century, defeat is not capitulation, but the loss of resilience. And if he is right, then what we are witnessing now is not a conflict, but the dismantling of the model on which the world has rested for the past decades. In his videos and statements, Jiang constantly returns to one idea that is hard to dismiss. Time is the main resource in war. And he argues that Iran used this resource to the fullest. The state did not simply build up weapons, but constructed a multi-layered strategy, from military doctrine to the ideological foundation. In his interpretation, this is not a country under sanctions, but a player that spent decades learning how to wage war under pressure and restrictions. He emphasizes that the preparation did not proceed linearly, through proxies, through local conflicts, through the constant testing of the enemy's reactions. And he considers that very 12-day episode as a key moment, not as a clash, but as data collection. What is the speed of reaction? Which systems become overloaded? Where does chaos arise? And most importantly, how much does it cost the other side? After that, according to his logic, the refinement phase began. And no, it was not simply that they got prepared, but that they adjusted the strategy based on real data. And this is where the effect appears that he considers critical. Iran is acting according to a scenario that has already been tested, even if on a smaller scale. You understand, right? As for the US, by his own estimates, it finds itself in the opposite position. It has not gone through similar adaptation. Its system was built for a different type of war, expensive, technological, with controlled escalation. And now, when the game against it is being played differently, it is forced to learn in the process, so to speak. And I think you yourselves understand perfectly well that learning during a war is always a loss of time. Jiang formulates it almost harshly. One side already knows how this war develops, while the other is only beginning to understand it. Then perhaps it is logical to ask a rather unpleasant question. If the scenario has really been calculated in advance, does it not turn out that the US is entering a conflict where many moves have already been predicted? And if so, then this is not about an equal game, but about a situation where one side still thinks this is improvisation, while the other has clearly been living inside a ready-made plan for a long time. At times, Jiang shifts the discussion into a plane where everything becomes extremely concrete, into numbers. And here, his argument sounds as harsh as possible. He says, imagine that an attack costs $50,000, while intercepting it can sometimes reach $15 million for complex systems. Now add probability to this. Not every interception is successful. Moreover, sometimes several missiles are used for a single target, and now one cheap object already consumes tens of millions. Next, he suggests calculating the scale. Suppose 100 cheap drones and missiles of different levels are launched per day. Even if half are shot down, that already amounts to tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in daily expenses just for defense. Per month, billions. And this does not include logistics, maintenance, or replenishment of stockpiles. At the same time, the production of such interceptors is a complex and slow process. You cannot simply press a button and double output. Now compare this with the attacking side. The production of Iranian drones is cheaper, faster, and technologically simpler. There is no arguing with that. Losses are not critical. They are built into the strategy. According to Jiang's logic, Iran does not aim for 100% efficiency. It is enough to overload the system. Even if 80% of threats are intercepted, the remaining 20% still cause damage, and the cost of that damage can be many times higher than the cost of the entire attack. And this is where the snowball effect appears. The more attacks, the faster expensive resources are depleted. The faster they are depleted, the higher the risk of shortages. And a shortage of air defense is already a strategic vulnerability. Jiang emphasizes this is not a one-time problem. but a sustained model of exhaustion. And his conclusion on this sounds almost like a formula. If the cost of defense systematically exceeds the cost of attack, then even with tactical successes, the strategic balance shifts, not because someone is stronger, but because one side can afford to continue while the other cannot. Here's what Jiang says, quote, "If you think the goal is to destroy the enemy's army, you are looking at the past. In modern conflict, the winner is the one who deprives the opponent of the ability to function as a state. And here, things that are rarely considered in the context of war come to the forefront: water and energy." Jiang analyzes in detail the vulnerability of the Persian Gulf countries. Their strength lies in oil, but their weakness lies in basic resources. Water there is not a natural resource, but a technological product. Desalination plants provide most of the supply, which makes them ideal targets: complex, expensive, and critically important. Strikes on such points are not just infrastructure damage, they are an immediate crisis. And now, dry mathematics. A large megapolis of 8 to 10 million people consumes millions of cubic meters of water daily. If a key plant goes out of operation, reserves in the system may last only a few days, at most a couple of weeks, under strict rationing. Now add to this the very cost of attack we just discussed. A drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can disable a facility worth billions. And it does not have to be completely destroyed. It is enough to disrupt key elements to stop the process. The same applies to oil and logistics. Strikes on transport hubs, routes, and bases. And the chain begins to break. And with it, not only the regional economy collapses, but also global financial flows. Jiang emphasizes, this is not a side effect, but the goal. Because through these nodes flows not just raw materials, but money that returns to the global system. So, as you understand, Iran is not trying to win in battle. It is trying to create a situation in which US allies become a source of instability, so that America is forced to spend resources maintaining a system that is itself beginning to fall apart from within. Here's another important topic the professor likes to reflect on. He links war not to the front line, but to the foundation of the global financial system. His logic is extremely harsh. The power of the US rests not only on the military, but also on trust in the dollar. And this trust, according to his model, is supported by a specific mechanism: oil, and how the money from it returns to the American economy. He lays out the chain almost like a formula. Oil is sold. Transactions are conducted in dollars. Gulf countries accumulate these dollars, then invest them back into US markets, technology, and infrastructure. A kind of capital circulation that has supported the system for decades. And now, in his opinion, it is precisely this linkage that is under the main odor. Ask yourself a question. What happens if one element drops out? If oil supplies become unstable? If infrastructure is under threat? If investors from the region begin not to invest, but to save their assets? Jiang argues, the chain begins to break at several levels at once. And then the problem is no longer the price of oil, but the fact that money stops returning to the system on which the American economy rests. And he especially emphasizes that the Persian Gulf countries are not just partners, but financial donors of entire sectors. And if they are forced to shift from investment to survival, the effect will be immediate, not gradual, not over years, but fast and quite painful. So it is no coincidence that the professor's main conclusion sounds almost like a warning. Iran does not strike the dollar directly, but the mechanism that has always supported it. There's no need to collapse the currency. It is enough to make it less necessary and less backed by real flows. Now, Professor Jiang goes further and links the war to something many do not associate with the Middle East at all: the technological boom, especially AI. His idea sounds bold. The modern growth of the US economy largely rests on investments in technology, and a significant portion of this money comes from outside, including from Gulf countries. He points to a troubling dependency. Data centers, infrastructure, and AI development require enormous investments and cheap energy. And where are energy and capital found? Precisely in the region that is now under pressure. And if this flow begins to be disrupted, technological growth loses its support. However, Jiang does not stop at finances. He points out the vulnerability of the facilities themselves. Data centers, energy hubs, logistics, these are physical targets. They cannot be moved to the cloud. They exist in specific locations. And if such places become unsafe, the entire model begins to wobble. Investors start to doubt. Companies calculate risks. Projects are frozen. Therefore, the expert suggests that if Iran decides to strike several key points in the US, it will create not just a local crisis, but trigger a chain reaction. Because confidence falls equals money, leaves equals development, slows equals company valuations, drop equals the market shakes. He is essentially saying, the modern economy is too dependent on expectations and trust. And if war hits these expectations, the consequences go far beyond the region. This is no longer about oil or the army, but about the future of technology. And you know what is important, according to the professor? He believes the problem is not that the US Army is weak, but that it is perfectly optimized for the previous war. Jiang constantly returns to the roots, to the origins. The entire architecture of American military power was formed after World War II and within the logic of the Cold War. Demonstration of force, technological superiority, complex systems designed to guarantee total dominance. But the question he asks is, what if the very nature of war has changed faster than this system? The professor explains this through a bias toward expensive perfection. Every element, from air defense to aviation, is an engineering masterpiece, but behind it stands an enormous cost. And in conditions where the opponent relies on mass and cheapness, such a model begins to stall. Not because it is bad, but because it is designed for a different type of pressure. In his opinion, there is another important point: the psychology of confidence. For many years, the US relied on a reputation of invincibility. But when its opponent, Iran, began to find ways to bypass or overload the system, the American aura began to crack. In fact, the US has found itself in a situation where it is forced to use the tools of the past against the threats of the future. And in such a configuration, even the strongest army can lose effectiveness. And if Jiang turns out to be right, then the United States is now catching up to a war that has already moved ahead. Here Jiang turns his reasoning into almost a war accounting, dry, harsh, and sobering. He says, forget ideology and politics for a moment. Let's calculate. And the numbers in his logic lead to a dead end. The first option is the so-called buyout. He names the scale, around $5 trillion. And no, this is not just compensation, but the total cost of stopping the conflict, lifting sanctions, security guarantees, infrastructure restoration, redistribution of influence in the region. And the question is a superpower ready to effectively admit defeat to Iran and pay an amount comparable to several years of its own military budget? Now let's talk about the second scenario. A ground operation. Here the numbers are even heavier. Jiang starts from a simple comparison. Iraq cost the US about $2 trillion with a much smaller territory and population. Iran, however, is nearly 90 million people, complex terrain, and a high level of mobilization. According to his logic, such an operation could easily exceed $3 to $6 trillion in the long term, not counting human losses and political consequences. But the key point here is not even the cost, if you think about it, Jiang believes. Without ground control, regime change is impossible because aviation can destroy but not govern. It is possible to weaken but not to replace power, which means that if the goal is specifically regime change, the US inevitably runs into the need to deploy troops. And here the third level of the trap arises: time. This is not a quick campaign, but years of presence, stabilization, and suppression of resistance. As a result, the professor asks an almost provocative question: is there a third option? Not to pay, not to invade, but simply to maintain pressure? And he answers himself, no, because a prolonged war of attrition in his model is even more expensive. Ongoing costs for air defense, logistics, and support of allies can reach tens of billions per month, a kind of slow draining of resources, so to speak. And you know what is most important? Whatever option the US chooses, it is already playing in a negative profit scenario. The question is no longer how much does victory cost, but what scale of losses is acceptable. And if both paths lead to weakening, then the choice is no longer strategic, but forced. What is also interesting is that Jiang does not limit himself to analyzing consequences. He tries to uncover the motivation, and he does this across three dimensions, each sounding increasingly harsh. The first is hubris, a classic mistake of empires. He draws direct historical parallels. When a system dominates for a long time, it begins to believe in its own invulnerability. Rapid successes create the illusion that all risks are controllable. Here, according to the professor, the United States may have overestimated its ability to manage escalation. The second reason is pragmatic and much more grounded: elite interests and political calculation. Jiang speaks directly about financial flows, investments, and support that can influence decisions. In his logic, even if war is unprofitable for the system as a whole, it may be beneficial for certain groups. Moreover, he points to the factor of domestic politics. War as a tool of consolidation, a way to strengthen positions, gain additional powers, and shift focus from internal problems. But the third point is the most controversial and perhaps the most resonant. Jiang speaks about the influence of closed elites and ideologies that, in his opinion, play a longer game. Here his argument goes beyond classical politics. He suggests that some decisions may be made not only from rational calculation, but also from beliefs tied to a grand historical mission. And in this, he sees danger. When actions stop being pragmatic and begin to follow a kind of scenario logic. It is important that Jiang does not present this as a fact, but as one possible explanatory model. But the very fact that he includes it in the analysis shows how, for him, what is happening between the US and Iran appears illogical within standard geopolitics. And here is the overall conclusion from these three reasons. The war may have started not because it was the optimal decision, but because several factors converged at once: overconfidence, interests, and ideologies. And when such things align, decisions are made not because they are beneficial, but because they can no longer be stopped.